I was sitting in the living room, unwinding after a long day at work. The silence was welcome, though I couldn't help but notice the absence of my wife. Normally, we both arrived home around the same time. Sometimes, we'd even meet at the front door. This time, however, she was running late. At first, I thought it was just traffic, or maybe she had stopped somewhere on her way. But as the minutes turned into an hour, I started to wonder. Finally, I heard the familiar sound of keys jangling, followed by the door swinging open. She entered quickly, her energy almost palpable. Without pausing, she announced that we had a grand project to tackle. I looked up from my chair, curious and a little skeptical. Projects weren't something we usually launched into without some discussion beforehand. She dropped her bag on the floor, collapsed onto the couch, and began explaining. Apparently, her friend Andrew, a colleague of hers, was planning a birthday celebration. His boyfriend, Samuel, had approached her for help. The two of them were keeping their relationship hidden from Andrew's conservative and deeply religious parents. They wanted to host a party for their friends after the formal family gathering, and my wife had volunteered us to assist. Listening to her talk, I tried to piece together the scope of what she had agreed to. It seemed Andrew and Samuel needed a venue for their secret celebration. My wife had offered up our country house without consulting me first. She explained that they would host the family dinner elsewhere, but after that, the royale party would take place at our place. It wasn't the first time she'd made spontaneous decisions, but this one felt bigger than most. While I wasn't against helping, I preferred to know what I was getting into beforehand. She added that she'd taken time off from work to fully dedicate herself to the preparations. Her plan was to visit the country house with Andrew and Samuel to inspect the property and show them around. Meanwhile, my job was straightforward: gather supplies. Food, drinks, decorations, anything they might need to make the party a success. She suggested I call my friend Joe for help with the shopping, and I agreed. It seemed like a manageable task. The next day, Joe and I headed to the hypermarket. Armed with a detailed list my wife had prepared, we began filling our cart. The list covered everything from snacks and drinks to cleaning supplies. As we moved through the aisles, I kept double-checking to ensure we hadn't missed anything. Despite our thoroughness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we might need something extra. Joe suggested we call my wife to confirm. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number, but she didn't answer. It wasn't unusual for her to be busy, so we kept shopping, picking up a few additional items just to be safe. After finishing most of the list, I tried calling her again. Still no answer. This time, I felt a slight unease. We loaded the car and decided to make a quick stop at home before heading to the country house. Just as we pulled into the driveway, my phone buzzed. She was calling back. "Hey," I said, relieved to hear from her. "We're almost done. Anything else we need?" Her voice sounded rushed. "Actually, can you grab one of my dresses from the closet? I need something clean to wear." "Why? What happened?" "I'll explain later," she replied hastily. "Just bring the dress. I've got to deal with the plumber right now." The mention of a plumber caught me off guard. There hadn't been any issues with the house the last time we were there. Still, I didn't press her for details. I went inside, picked a dress that seemed appropriate, and drove to the country house with Joe. When we arrived, the scene was unexpected. My wife was standing in the kitchen wearing a bathrobe, her hair damp. Samuel and Andrew were nearby, chatting casually. The house looked pristine, with no sign of any recent plumbing emergency. I handed her the dress and asked what had happened. She explained that while they were cleaning, she had decided to test the water system. Apparently, a pipe had a small leak, and when she turned on a faucet, it sprayed her with freezing water. She assured me the plumber had already fixed the issue. I glanced around. The floors were dry, and there was no visible evidence of a leak. It seemed strange that such a mess could be cleaned up so thoroughly in such a short amount of time. Joe nudged me and whispered, "Doesn't look like there was a major problem here." How did they fix it so fast? It was a fair point. I turned back to my wife. If the pipe burst, wouldn't there be some water damage? She rolled her eyes. Don't listen to them, she said, gesturing toward Samuel and Andrew. They don't know the first thing about plumbing. It wasn't a big deal, just a small issue with the faucet. I opened it too hard, and it splashed everywhere. They're exaggerating. To back up her story, she handed me a receipt from the plumber. The details seemed legitimate enough, and I decided to drop the matter. Joe and I carried the groceries into the kitchen, stocking the fridge and pantry with supplies for the party. The work kept us busy, but my mind wandered back to the supposed plumbing issue. Everything had been in perfect condition when we last left the house. It seemed odd for a problem to arise and be resolved so quickly. Despite her explanation, I couldn't help but feel there was more to the story. The thought lingered as we wrapped up our tasks, and I made a mental note to keep an eye on things. The next morning started earlier than I expected. My wife woke me up as she bustled around the bedroom, clearly getting ready for something. She was already half-dressed and looking for something in the closet. Rubbing my eyes, I asked, "Where are you off to so early? And why are you so dressed up?" She glanced over her shoulder, her expression both excited and a little rushed. "I've got plans with a friend. She knows a guy who works at a warehouse, and he's going to help us with something important for the party. We're renting a tent for the outdoor portion, you know, for the barbecue and everything. It'll keep the sun off everyone." I sat up, still trying to process what she was saying. "A tent? You didn't mention that before." "It just came to me yesterday," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It'll make things a lot better. Besides, Andrew is coming by later with a minivan so we can load it up. We're also checking on some chairs because I'm not sure the warehouse has enough of what we need. But don't worry, I've got it covered." "And what am I supposed to do while you're off picking out tents and chairs?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled, clearly having anticipated my question. "You've got an important task too. You'll need to head to the country house with the mower and take care of the backyard. The grass has grown out, and there's some junk back there that needs clearing. We can't have it looking like a jungle for the party." That seemed reasonable enough. "All right," I said, nodding. "But why the fancy outfit? You're just going to a warehouse." She grinned, straightening her blouse. "You know how people are more willing to help when you look nice. I'm hoping to negotiate a discount on the rental. Trust me, it'll pay off." "If you say so," I replied, getting out of bed. Within half an hour, her friend arrived, honking the horn outside. She grabbed her bag, kissed me on the cheek, and dashed out the door. I watched her leave, then turned my attention to the mower. It hadn't been used in a while, so I checked the oil and made sure it was in working order before loading it into the truck. The drive to the country house was uneventful, but as soon as I arrived, I could see what she meant about the backyard. The grass was overgrown, and a few piles of debris were scattered around. I sighed, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. I started with the junk, hauling old branches, broken pots, and miscellaneous garbage to the side for later disposal. As I worked, I called my dad to catch up and ended up telling him about the party preparations. He found the whole situation amusing and offered some advice on keeping things organized. While clearing the debris, I stumbled upon a dusty old bag filled with what looked like clothes and linens. Curious, I paused to inspect it. The contents were worn but still usable. I figured I should ask my wife if she wanted me to sort through it or just throw it out. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number, but as usual, she didn't pick up. By this point, it was starting to get on my nerves. It wasn't the first time she'd ignored my calls, and it always seemed to happen at the most inconvenient moments. I set the bag aside and went back to mowing the lawn. The mower roared to life, and within an hour, the backyard looked significantly better. I cleared the remaining clippings, making sure everything was neat. Just as I was finishing up, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It was my wife, and she wasn't alone. Andrew was with her, driving the minivan she had mentioned earlier. They got out, and while Andrew started unloading the tent and chairs from the back, my wife came over to inspect the yard. I pointed out the cleaned-up space and asked her why she hadn't answered my calls earlier. "I was busy talking to the warehouse guy," she said, brushing off my concern. "And the reception there was terrible. Honestly, I barely got through to Andrew at one point. We almost ended up with the wrong size tent because I couldn't get a hold of Samuel to confirm the measurements." Andrew chimed in, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, it was a close call. Luckily, everything worked out in the end." I decided to let it go for now and turned my attention to the tent. "Looks good," I said, inspecting the material. "Did you get a rental agreement?" She hesitated for a moment before replying. "The guy forgot to stamp the paperwork, but he said he'd give it to my friend later. Don't worry, though. I've got the receipt, and we got it at a discount. He cut us a great deal." It sounded plausible, so I didn't push the issue. She showed me a photo of the tent fully set up at the warehouse, which seemed to match what we needed. Satisfied for now, I helped Andrew unload the rest of the supplies while my wife went to inspect my handiwork in the backyard. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Then she turned to me with a smile. "You did a fantastic job. The yard looks amazing. We might have to spend a weekend out here ourselves once this party is over." Her praise caught me off guard but was appreciated nonetheless. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride as I looked over the now pristine yard. The thought of spending some quiet time out here together was appealing, but for now, there was still work to be done. The party preparations were far from over, and I had a feeling the days ahead would be just as busy. The next day was a welcome change of pace. Everything seemed calm, and I felt like we finally had a moment to breathe. Over breakfast, I decided to address something that had been bothering me. I told my wife that I didn't appreciate being left in the dark and that she needed to stop ignoring my calls. "You've been acting strange," I said, keeping my tone even. She set her coffee cup down with a slight huff. "Do you think I enjoy running around and arranging everything?" she shot back. "This isn't exactly my idea of fun, you know. But fine, if you think I'm just wasting time, let's split the work." I wasn't expecting her to take it so personally, but she continued. "We need a generator for the sound system and lighting. As you know, our old one broke down back in the winter." I nodded, vaguely recalling the issue. "So, what's your plan?" "You'll go with Samuel to pick up a generator from a guy I know. I'll stay back and sort through our extension cords, lamps, and string lights. Once you bring the generator to the country house, I'll head over to set everything up," she explained. "Sounds simple enough," I said. "But before we go borrowing equipment, let me check on our old generator. It's in the garage, and I might have fixed it." She gave me a skeptical look. "If you want to waste your time on that, be my guest. I'd rather you just relax today and head out for the new one tomorrow." Her doubt only fueled my determination. After breakfast, I went to the garage and dug out the generator. It was dusty and a bit worse for wear, but I was optimistic. I spent a good part of the morning cleaning it, checking the fuel lines, and inspecting the motor. Finally, I attempted to start it, but it sputtered and died repeatedly. No amount of tweaking seemed to help. Frustrated, I realized my wife had been right, it was a lost cause. Reluctantly, I called Samuel to confirm plans for the next day. "Let's meet up and get that generator," I said. He agreed, and before hanging up, I asked if Andrew would be joining us. "Andrew's working all day," Samuel replied. "It'll just be the two of us." "Got it," I said, ending the call. With that settled, I spent the rest of the day tidying up the garage and mentally preparing for another busy day ahead. The following morning, my wife left early, as usual. She had her own errands to run, leaving me to wait for Samuel. Right on time, he pulled up outside in a van, and we loaded up. As we drove across town, we joked about how every task seemed to require a trip to the farthest corner of the city. "Why is it never close by?" Samuel asked with a laugh. Because that'd be too easy, I replied, shaking my head. Despite the inconvenience, the mood was light, and the drive passed quickly. We eventually arrived at the contact's place, a small workshop tucked away in an industrial area. The guy met us outside and showed us the generator. He started it up to prove it was in good working condition, and I had to admit it looked and sounded great. I thanked him, and with Samuel's help, we loaded it into the van. The man waved us off as we headed back toward the country house. The drive back was uneventful until we pulled into the driveway and saw both my wife and Andrew waiting for us. I raised an eyebrow, stepping out of the van. "I thought you were working all day," I said to Andrew. He grinned sheepishly. "I managed to convince my boss to let me go early," he admitted. "Took a bit of creative storytelling, but here I am." I turned to my wife. "And you? Didn't expect you to beat us here." "I tried calling you," she said, holding up her phone. "But you didn't pick up." Confused, I pulled out my phone and checked it. "There's no missed call," I said. "You sure you dialed the right number?" She showed me her call log, and sure enough, there was an outgoing call to me. I frowned, realizing there might have been a glitch somewhere. All right, maybe it didn't go through. No big deal. With that minor misunderstanding cleared up, we got to work setting up the equipment. The generator was unloaded and positioned carefully behind the house. We tested it along with the lighting and sound system, running cables and checking every connection. It all worked perfectly. The tent area was well lit, and the speakers were clear and loud without any distortion. Seeing it all come together was satisfying. The generator wasn't the only thing that needed testing. We spent time arranging the layout, ensuring the lighting covered all the critical spots while avoiding any awkward blind spots. Samuel was especially helpful, offering suggestions based on past experiences with outdoor events. Andrew, despite arriving unexpectedly, jumped right in, helping adjust the cables and arrange the setup. While the sound system was being tested, my wife was already thinking ahead. She mentioned how the setup would not only work for the party but might even be useful for future gatherings. I could tell she was already brainstorming ways to repurpose everything once the birthday was over. As the sun began to set, we stood back and admired our work. My wife turned to me and smiled. "You know, the hardest part is behind us. The big stuff is done. Now we just need to focus on the little details." Andrew and Samuel agreed, and after a few more minutes of chatting, everyone started packing up. There was still plenty of time before the party, and for once, it felt like we were ahead of schedule. As we all headed back home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It had been a long, busy day, but we were making progress, and that was what mattered. Another calm day passed without much excitement. Late in the afternoon, my father called me, his voice carrying an unusual urgency. He needed my help with some repairs at his house and asked if I could come as soon as possible. I didn't hesitate and told him I'd be there. My wife, noticing my hurried preparation, asked what was going on. "Dad needs help with some repairs," I explained while grabbing my keys. She smiled and waved me off. "No problem. Go ahead. I was thinking of inviting my friend over for some wine anyway." That seemed fine by me, and I left, focusing on the task ahead. At my father's place, the day stretched on as we tackled one repair after another. Plumbing issues, a broken door hinge, and even some light electrical work kept us busy for hours. Despite the long day, it felt good to help him out, and we ended the evening with a quick dinner together. As I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a photo from my wife. The picture showed her and her friend at home, laughing with glasses of wine in hand. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough, but something about it caught my eye. There was a small detail that didn't sit right. In the background, I noticed a wedding photo that had been shifted to an unusual angle, something my wife would never do. Then I saw it, a faint glimpse of a mole on her hand, one that she'd had removed months ago. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a recent photo. It had to be taken long before today. The realization hit me hard. Why would my wife send an old photo, pretending it was from tonight? Questions began racing through my mind. Was she hiding something? And if so, why? My thoughts wandered back to the odd moments over the past few weeks, her unavailability during calls, the strange errands, and how she always seemed to arrange things so that we were in different places. I decided not to confront her immediately. There was no point in rushing into accusations without concrete evidence. When I returned home late that night, the house was quiet. My wife was already asleep in the bedroom, and the kitchen bore the signs of their evening, 2 wine glasses on the counter, one of which appeared to have been recently washed. Something about the setup felt staged, as if it had been deliberately left out for me to see. As I walked through the living room, I noticed something odd under the couch. Reaching down, I pulled out a sock. It was unmistakably Andrew's. He had a penchant for wearing eccentric, brightly colored socks, and this one was no exception, a long, yellow sock with a quirky pattern. I stared at it for a moment, piecing things together. Could it be that Andrew and Samuel weren't what they seemed? The thought unsettled me. I decided to investigate further. If my suspicions were correct, I needed proof. Moving silently, I crept into the bedroom and retrieved my wife's phone from her nightstand. She had recently set up a password, which was unusual for her. Remembering a casual comment she'd made months ago, I recalled that her best friend knew the code in case of emergencies. I decided to use that to my advantage. Dialing her friend, I kept my tone light. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but my wife fell asleep and I noticed a $50 charge on her phone. I'm not sure what it's for, and I'm thinking of blocking the card. Could you help me unlock her phone to check?" Her friend hesitated for a moment before replying. "All right, but please don't tell her I gave it to you." She recited the code, and I thanked her before hanging up. Unlocking the phone, I quickly scrolled through her messages and found a hidden chat labeled "Birthday of Hypocrites." The title struck me as ironic. Opening it, I began reading the messages, and what I discovered left me in shock. Andrew and Samuel weren't gay at all. They had been pretending for years to maintain a certain image, using it as a cover to avoid suspicion while they engaged in affairs with other people's partners. The chat detailed their carefully planned schemes, including excuses, alibis, and rotations. Whenever I was with Samuel, my wife would be with Andrew, and vice versa. The level of deception was staggering. There were photos, plans, and even jokes about how convincing their performances were. I felt a surge of anger and disgust but knew I needed to stay composed. Taking screenshots of everything, I sent the evidence to my phone for safekeeping. Confronting her immediately would be satisfying, but I wanted a plan, something that would leave a lasting impact. An idea began to form as I thought about the upcoming birthday celebration. My father's workshop was stocked with tools and gadgets, and he'd taught me plenty about rigging setups. I decided to turn the event into a lesson they'd never forget. The house would be filled with surprises, carefully hidden traps that would expose their lies and make them regret underestimating me. The preparations would take time and precision, but I was confident in my abilities. Every step of the setup played out in my mind, rigging doors to create loud distractions, setting up sound effects to interrupt their conversations, and even planting fake messages to see how they'd react. By the time I was done, the party would be a disaster for them and a revelation for everyone else. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep, I felt a strange sense of calm. For once, I wasn't reacting impulsively. Instead, I was taking control of the situation, ensuring that the truth would come out on my terms. The next few days would be critical for planning and execution. Every detail had to be perfect, every trap placed strategically to maximize the impact. When the party finally began, it would be an unforgettable experience for everyone involved. My wife and her friends thought they were clever, but they had no idea what was coming. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about exposing the lies and deceit that had infiltrated my life. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but smile. The program I was planning wouldn't just be explosive in a figurative sense, it would be the kind of event that left a mark. Get ready, I thought to myself. The real fun is about to begin. Early in the morning, I made a call to my parents to explain the situation in detail. I told them about my plan and how I needed their help to pull it off. My mother agreed to play her part, which involved calling my wife and pretending that she urgently needed her help at their house. Meanwhile, my father and I would head to the country house under the pretense of doing final preparations. Later, I would personally present the finished house to my wife and her friends. My parents were on board, and everything was set into motion. About half an hour later, my mother called my wife as planned. Using a worried tone, she told her that she needed immediate assistance. My wife, visibly caught off guard, quickly agreed to help. "Of course, I'll be right over," she said, her voice tinged with concern. When she told me about the call, I nodded sympathetically and offered to drive her there. I explained that my father and I would also head to the country house later to take care of some final touches. She didn't argue, though I could tell she was a bit on edge. As we drove to my parents' house, she seemed distracted, glancing at her phone and sending quick messages. It was clear that my mother's request had thrown off whatever plans she might have had for the day. We arrived at my parents' house, where my mother greeted us warmly. She led my wife to the kitchen and whispered to me as they passed, "Don't worry, I've got a long list of unpleasant chores to keep her busy. You'll have plenty of time." I nodded and exchanged a knowing look with my father. We loaded his car with tools and supplies, including a few extras I had prepared earlier. Once everything was ready, we set off for the country house to begin our work. Upon arriving, I walked him through my plan, and we got straight to business. Our first project was the water heater. We carefully dismantled the boiler and mixed a concoction of rotten egg yolks and vinegar inside. It was a simple trick, but guaranteed to create a foul stench for anyone who used the shower. It was the perfect starting point. Next, we moved to the backyard sprinkler system. We drained it and replaced the water with a concoction we had prepared earlier, a mix of sour sludge, surströmming, and skunk essence. The smell was overwhelming even as we worked, and we had to take short breaks to avoid gagging. To make it even more effective, we installed motion sensors that would activate the sprinklers when triggered. The sensors were remotely controlled, so we could turn them on or off as needed. It was a masterpiece of mischief. With those traps in place, we shifted focus to the bedroom. The wardrobe in our country house was located in the corner, and the only seating option in the room was the bed. Knowing this, we rigged the bed frame with a collapsing mechanism. When someone sat on it, the bed would fold in half, delivering a sharp and painful surprise. Not dangerous, but definitely memorable. In the living room, we created another set of traps. 2 chairs were decorated festively with the names of the birthday boy and his partner. One chair contained a hidden firecracker that would go off with a loud explosion when someone sat on it. The other chair was wired with a big battery setup that would deliver a good electric shock. These chairs were the crowning touch to our setup. My father and I worked tirelessly throughout the day, ensuring every trap was perfectly set. By the time we were done, the house looked normal on the surface but was rigged to deliver a series of escalating surprises. I couldn't have done it without my dad, and I made sure to thank him sincerely. "I really appreciate this," I told him as we packed up our tools. "Anything for a good laugh," he replied with a grin. On our way back, I picked up my wife from my parents' house. She looked utterly exhausted, and I could tell my mother had put her through the ringer. "Your mom had me cleaning out the attic," she complained, leaning back in her seat. Then it was scrubbing grout in the bathroom. "I've never done so much gross work in one day." "She's thorough," I said, trying to hide my amusement. "At least it's over now. You can rest tonight." "I need it," she muttered, closing her eyes for a moment. "I'm dead tired." When we got home, she went straight to bed, and I whispered a quick thank you to my mom over the phone for keeping her occupied. My mother was delighted with how everything had gone and assured me that my wife would be too tired to question anything. After she was settled, I finally allowed myself to relax. The preparations were complete, and everything was in place for the grand finale. Tomorrow, I would invite my wife and her friends to the country house for the grand reveal of all our hard work. Little did they know what awaited them. As I settled into the couch and turned on my favorite show, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. The traps were set, and the stage was ready. All I had to do now was wait. Tomorrow was going to be unforgettable. The day of Andrew's birthday began with a sense of grim determination. I woke up early and called him to wish him a happy birthday, keeping my voice cheerful and light. This will be the last time I'll ever celebrate his birthday, I thought as I spoke. After exchanging pleasantries, I told him that my wife and I would pick him and Samuel up to show them the country house before the party. Andrew sounded thrilled, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. While I was on the phone, my wife was upstairs getting ready. She spent extra time on her makeup and chose a dress that seemed far too formal for the occasion. Watching her, I felt a pang of bitter satisfaction. If only you knew how pointless all this is, I thought, but I kept my mouth shut and urged her to hurry. She nodded, finishing up quickly. Once we were ready, I started the car, and we drove to pick up Andrew and Samuel. They were already waiting outside when we arrived, chatting and smiling as if this were just another normal day. They hopped into the back seat, thanking us for all the effort we'd put into preparing the house for the party. I nodded along, keeping my responses short and focusing on the drive ahead. When we arrived at the country house, I parked the car and gestured toward the backyard. "Why don't you take a look around? The garden's the best part," I suggested. They eagerly agreed and headed off toward the sprinkler system. Meanwhile, I stayed behind, pulled out my phone, and activated the motion sensors I had installed earlier. The chaos began almost instantly. Their horrified screams echoed through the yard as the sprinklers activated, spraying them with the putrid mix of surströmming, skunk essence, and sour sludge. "What is this?" Andrew shouted, gagging loudly. "What's wrong with the water?" I walked over, feigning confusion. "Oh no," I said, trying to look concerned. "It must be the sprinkler system. We haven't used it in ages, maybe something went bad." The smell was overwhelming, and both Andrew and Samuel were visibly nauseated. My wife, alarmed by the commotion, quickly excused herself and went upstairs to take a shower. While Andrew and Samuel attempted to escape the smell by heading indoors, my wife unknowingly walked into the second trap. The rancid mixture we had placed in the water heater was doing its job. Moments later, her scream echoed through the house, followed by the sound of retching. "The shower smells even worse," she yelled. I smirked to myself as she stormed out of the bathroom, her hair wet and her clothes reeking of the foul stench. "I'm going to find something clean to wear," she muttered, making her way toward the bedroom. Meanwhile, I led Andrew and Samuel to the living room. "Why don't you sit down for a bit?" I suggested, gesturing to the festive chairs we had prepared earlier. Just as they approached the chairs, we were interrupted by another scream from upstairs. My wife had triggered the bed trap. The sound of the mechanism snapping shut was followed by her cry of shock. I rushed upstairs, putting on a concerned face. When I reached her, she was sitting on the floor, clearly shaken but unharmed. The bed had folded partially under her weight, delivering a painful but non-injurious surprise. "I'm fine," she muttered, waving me off. "Probably just slipped." I returned to the living room, where Andrew and Samuel were still standing near the chairs, looking confused. "Don't worry about her," I said. "She's fine." "Why don't you take a seat?" Reluctantly, they did. The results were immediate. A loud bang erupted from Andrew's chair as the firecracker went off, sending him flying to the floor. Samuel, meanwhile, let out a cry of pain as the electric shock coursed through his body. Both men scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with fear and confusion. Without saying a word, they bolted out of the house, running as fast as they could toward the road. My wife, hearing the commotion, rushed down the stairs to see what had happened. But in her haste, she slipped on the last few steps and tumbled to the floor. Her scream was sharp, and when I reached her, she was clutching her leg in pain. "I think it's broken," she whimpered. This was not part of the plan. I quickly called an ambulance, staying by her side until the paramedics arrived. They confirmed that her leg was fractured and took her to the hospital. I followed in my car, maintaining my role as the concerned husband. At the hospital, I sat with her while the doctors set her leg and admitted her for observation. She was clearly in pain and exhausted from the ordeal. I need to take care of some paperwork and run a few errands, I told her, using it as an excuse to leave. She nodded weakly, too drained to question me. Once outside, I pulled out my phone and began executing the next phase of my plan. I compiled all the evidence I had gathered, photos, screenshots of messages, and incriminating details, and started sending them to everyone in Andrew and Samuel's social circles. Friends, family, and colleagues received the shocking truth about their lies and infidelities. The responses were immediate and explosive. Messages of disbelief and outrage poured in as their carefully constructed facade crumbled before their eyes. But I wasn't done yet. Exposing Andrew and Samuel was only part of the plan. My wife's betrayal still loomed large, and I had no intention of letting her off the hook. The traps and public humiliation were just the beginning. Ending my marriage was the final step, and I was determined to see it through. As I drove away from the hospital, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over me. Everything was falling into place. The chaos I had unleashed was only the start, and I wasn't about to stop now. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over my life. My wife's actions had broken the trust we once shared, and there was no going back. The conclusion of this chapter would be decisive, and I was ready to write it. While my wife was still in the hospital, I made a call to a divorce attorney. The decision felt like a weight lifted from my chest. I explained everything to him, her betrayal, the lies, the humiliation, and told him I wanted to proceed with ending the marriage as soon as possible. The attorney assured me that with the evidence I had, things would move quickly. I hung up, ready to take the next steps. Over the following days, while she remained in the hospital, I packed up all her belongings. Piece by piece, I gathered her clothes, shoes, and personal items, stuffing them into suitcases and trash bags. Every drawer, every shelf, I left nothing behind. As I worked, I made sure to separate any shared items, keeping everything valuable, especially the electronics. Those would serve as additional evidence if needed. By the time I was finished, the house felt emptier, quieter, a blank slate for me to start over. Once everything was packed, I loaded her belongings into the trunk of my car. My plan was clear. I wasn't going to let her step foot back into my house. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I waited until she was ready to be discharged from the hospital to set things in motion. When the doctors informed her that she'd need to use a wheelchair temporarily while her fracture healed, I played the part of the caring husband. I showed up on time, helped her into the car, and reassured her that everything would be fine. She seemed relieved, though her mood shifted as she started asking questions. What happened to the party? How are Andrew and Samuel? Is everything okay? She asked, her tone uncertain. Everything's fine, I replied curtly. Don't worry about it. She nodded, sensing my shortness but too exhausted to press further. As I drove, I noticed her watching the familiar streets of our neighborhood. But when I passed by our house without stopping, confusion flickered across her face. Where are we going? She asked, a hint of alarm in her voice. You'll see, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I turned onto the street leading to her parents' house, and that's when the realization hit her. Her eyes widened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Why are we going here? She demanded, her voice shaking. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and looked her straight in the eye. We're done, I said firmly. I know about your affair. I've known for a while now. There's no coming back from this. Her reaction was immediate. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she began pleading. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. It was a mistake. Please, give me another chance. I shook my head, unmoved. It's over. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Your things are in the trunk. You can stay here with your parents. The divorce papers will be sent to you soon. Her parents came out to meet us, looking confused and concerned. I helped her out of the car, handed over her bags, and said only one thing to them: the papers are on their way. Then I got back in the car and drove off, leaving her to explain the situation to them. In the days that followed, I finalized the paperwork with my attorney and sent the documents to her. Predictably, she hired her own lawyer to contest the terms, hoping to drag things out. Her attorney tried every trick in the book to delay the process, but with the mountain of evidence I had, their efforts were futile. Photos, messages, timestamps, everything pointed to her infidelity. The case was open and shut. During the legal process, I learned from mutual friends that her situation with Andrew and Samuel had taken a dramatic turn. Apparently, she had attempted to maintain some kind of relationship with them, forming what she described as a love triangle. But it didn't take long for cracks to appear. The three of them began fighting, the jealousy, mistrust, and resentment boiled over. One argument even escalated into a physical altercation, with Andrew and Samuel coming to blows. The thought of those two idiots punching each other over her was more amusing than I cared to admit. Eventually, their little triangle collapsed entirely. Samuel moved out of the city, Andrew deleted his social media accounts, and my ex-wife was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered personal life. It was poetic justice, watching them self-destruct after all the effort they had put into deceiving everyone around them. As for me, the divorce was finalized within a few months. The division of assets went smoothly thanks to the irrefutable evidence of her misconduct. She received none of the sentimental items she'd hoped to keep, and the house remained mine. Once everything was settled, I cut off all communication with her. There was nothing left to say. I focused on rebuilding my life. With her gone, the house felt like a sanctuary. I redecorated, made repairs, and turned it into a space that truly felt like my own. I reconnected with friends, spent more time with my family, and even took up a few new hobbies. It was refreshing to live without the constant tension and doubt that had plagued our marriage. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about her from mutual acquaintances. Apparently, she had moved on, trying to rebuild her life in her own way. Good for her, I thought. I wasn't bitter anymore. If anything, I was grateful that the truth had come out and that I'd had the strength to walk away. One evening, I received a message from a friend who had been close to both me and my ex-wife. "You'll never believe this," he wrote. "Remember Andrew and Samuel? They got into a fist fight at a party last week. Everyone's talking about it." I couldn't help but laugh. Even after everything, those two were still a disaster. Now, years later, I rarely think about my ex-wife or her failed relationships. My life has moved on, and so have I. I've built something better for myself, a life free of lies, full of peace and happiness. In the end, the chaos they brought into my world only made me stronger. Her betrayal was the catalyst for a complete transformation. What she thought would break me only pushed me to rebuild, better and stronger than before. The scars remain, but they're a reminder of how far I've come. And for that, I'll always be grateful.